to the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone. I'm the Mid-High Director here at Boston Avenue. And today's co-host is Caitlin Drake, the Communications Director.
Hi, Philip.
Hey, Caitlin. And today's guest is Reverend David Wiggs, the senior pastor here at Boston Avenue. And David, to get started, what have you been up to lately?
Well, I was in Kansas City this last week, as you might know. I was at a meeting that's taken the name UMC Next, which is a group of United Methodists from across the United States who have felt like we've taken the wrong turn in voting in what's called the traditional plan into our discipline. And so there was a meeting convened to discuss what we might do other than that.
And who was invited to that meeting, or how did you get to be at that meeting?
Yes, there was a open nominations process that the host group, which was the United Methodist Church of the Resurrection, made available online. And so I think there were some 2,500 people nominated, and out of those nominations, they selected 10 people from each annual conference and invited them. But for example, I know in our annual conference, a couple of the first 10 were not able to go to Kansas City on those dates. And so to make sure we still had 10 people representing our annual conference, others were added. So I was on that list and got invited primarily because I'm at one of our larger churches. And so they were wanting the pastors from our largest churches that are moderate or progressive to be in attendance.
Can you tell us about the representation? I mean, who all made up the people at the gathering? Who were invited?
Right. So 600 people, 60 different annual conferences, 10 people from every annual conference. Those are annual conferences within the U.S. Of those, 375 were clergy people, 225 were laity. 160 of those 600 were self-identified as being a part of the LGBTQ community.
What expectations do you have coming into the meeting?
I really thought and continue to think this is a possibility that we are looking at some kind of new alignment, or some would call it a new division or a split within our larger United Methodist Church. So I really went expecting maybe a plan to be offered that facilitated that, but that was really not the case. That's really not where we started. We really started more with just a discussion of how people were feeling, what had been happening in their churches, what harm was being done to LGBTQ people who are already in the ministry or already in our churches simply by the passage of the traditional plan at our special general conference in 2019.
Can you tell us more about the kind of range of perspectives or viewpoints that were represented there?
Sure. So we're in Kansas City, sort of in the center of the country. Here we are in Oklahoma, similar kind of situation. Compared to the East Coast or the West Coast, really different perspectives in terms of where their church is or where their city is or where their culture or society is. So really some different ideas in terms of what should happen next and whether or not we should maintain a connection to the United Methodist Church at all. Some pastors coming where their majority of their congregation are LGBTQ people. So to think about staying in a church who's condemned them seems not only improbable but almost impossible for them to consider. Whereas somebody like myself or other people who come from the heartland have more of a view that we can continue to increase our hospitality and welcome for a variety of people without having to leave the denomination necessarily.
Can you tell us about the 4 commitments that were discussed at the conference?
I can. So there was a convening team of about 30 people, and they had worked ahead of time on articulating why this gathering and why now. So they're trying to reclaim. The first thing they were doing basically was trying to reclaim or re-articulate our Wesleyan theology within Methodism. That's really anchored in Scripture and informed by tradition, experience, and reason. But they want to make sure that we remember Wesley's history of saying that opinions and doctrines are very slender, if at all, a part of Methodism, and keeping the openness and inclusion and the idea that we think and let think, which is what John Wesley said about the way we approach theology, trying to reclaim that. So sort of that Wesleyan vision of faith and practice was the first commitment. The next one's really grounded in our baptismal vows, where we say that we will resist evil, injustice, and oppression in all their forms. So the second commitment rehearsed that and includes full affirmation of participation of people of all ages, nations, races, classes, cultures, and we included gender identities, sexual orientations, and abilities. The third one is a specific rejection of the traditional plan as approved by the General Conference in 2019 as inconsistent with the gospel of Christ. The fourth one stated that this group will work to eliminate all the discriminatory language and restrictions and penalties that are now in the discipline that have any kind of connection to LGBTQ people. And we reaffirmed as part of that one the sacred worth of all people, including LGBTQ folks, and that we are anxious to celebrate their gifts and their commitments in the life of our church as we go forward.
Can you describe the three different options or the paths forward that were discussed?
Yeah, it's pretty complicated actually, but I'll try to give a thumbnail sketch of each. So one idea is that it's clear that there's a pretty different approach to faith and ministry between the most conservative elements and the most liberal elements within Methodism, and the moderates are somewhere clearly in the middle, or sometimes they're called centrist, some of them leaning left, some leaning right. But the idea would be that there would be a group of leaders from a variety of perspectives that might get together and come up with a plan to go ahead and figure out how the denomination could realign into two or three expressions of Methodism. They would still all be Methodist, but divide into three different groups rather than all being tied as United Methodist. Exactly how affiliated or associated those two or three groups would be is not clear, but to forge a path ahead that it has more than one opportunity or is beyond what we currently have as a United Methodist Church. The second plan is that a group could leave and reaffiliate. That could happen on the left or the right. In this context, since this was a gathering of moderates and progressives, the discussion was about whether or not there is a group that would like to leave and form something new, a new form or expression of Methodism. The third option was to stay and work at resisting the traditional plan and reforming the denomination in terms of what we've put into our discipline in terms of how we'll treat people, particularly around LGBTQ issues. And then it really is a bigger discussion about whether or not our bureaucracy has become too large, whether we need to streamline our infrastructure, whether we need to address the size of apportionments, what's the role of general agencies, what's the role of bishops, all those kind of things kind of emerged as part of the discussion under the stay, resist, and reform. So anyway, that's kind of a broad outline of the three kind of different pathways that were discussed.
I feel like it's kind of in the book of discipline, or at least should be, that you can't have a huge United Methodist gathering without at least doing a lot of polls and a lot of voting.
Okay.
So there were straw polls that were done on these three options. Can you tell us about how they were voted on, or what was the process of that?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers in front of me. There were a variety of straw polls at different points in the discussion, trying to just get a sense of the room and what people wanted to talk about next and which way people were leaning. By the end of the meeting, I would say the primary approach that the majority probably were endorsing is the stay, resist, and reform kind of idea of continuing to work within the denomination and through the legislative processes that our structure allows, which would impact what goes in or comes out of the book of discipline, and yet at the same time, for churches, individuals, pastors, leadership groups to continue to be in full ministry with people in the LGBTQ community.
So one of the paths that you talked about, this kind of reform, resist within, we already have the Reconciling Ministries Network within the United Methodist Church. So did they have a presence at the conference, and kind of what was your sense of where they're at?
Yes, there were a lot of people affiliated with the Reconciling Ministries Network there, including their executive director is on the convening team and spoke before the gathering on a number of occasions. There were a lot of Reconciling Ministries Network affiliated churches and pastors as well attending. So I think there's a vital conversation going on between those two groups. Primarily, the Reconciling Ministries Network group has been a sort of a voice of resistance, as well as a voice for full inclusion for a number of years. So I think they will continue to be that. But I would say this broadened their support and was a broader group than has participated previously with RMN.
What are some examples of what resistance would look like on this path?
It really varied by region, depending on where local churches are and what's happened up to now in a particular region of the country, or a particular annual conference, or a particular local church. But I would say it ranges everything from more teaching and preaching in local congregations to varieties of sort of what I would call biblical obedience, which would be in the same vein as civil disobedience in terms of other kind of protest or resistance movements like the civil rights movement, where certain persons might be choosing, or whole churches or whole annual conferences choosing not to abide by what they feel like are unjust restrictions that are now going to be put in the discipline that will become effective January of 2020. And so that might be a pastor doing a same-gender wedding, which is prohibited in this in our book of discipline, and will continue to be prohibited with even greater punishments possibly under the new language that will be inserted into the discipline, to churches elevating LGBTQ people in terms of leadership, supporting people out of that community who are moving in as candidates for ministry as they feel a call upon their own lives. So it's a wide variety of things that I think might come under the banner of resistance or reform.
I'm a little more positive about that option than I was during the week. Because whenever I was trying to follow it, and whenever I was following through on whatever social media I was following, it seemed to be like more of what we've done and more of the same is what I felt that it was. But hearing you talk about ways that we can resist and can show and can resist what's going on, it's more active than I had assumed it would be.
I think that's a correct assumption.
And I think it's broader. I
Yes.
think up to this point, most of the resistance has been, specific pockets or regions, or certain churches, or the Reconciling Ministries Network. And I think that General Conference really mobilized a whole group of people who otherwise weren't engaged in this conversation or in this resistance movement.
I think that's right. I think there were a good number of people within the United Methodist Church that believe we were sort of automatically moving to a more progressive position, and that something like the One Church Plan, which was proposed at the 2019 General Conference, would automatically become a more open option when that was voted down, and a more restrictive option was voted in. I think a large group that was pretty much in the center or moderate place within the United Methodist Church spectrum of perspectives theologically and in terms of social issues felt obligated to take a stand to still support a person's freedom of conscience and freedom of ministry, and for all people to be able to respond to a call from God to go into ministry and those kind of things. So I think there is a good deal more energy and a much larger group of people, particularly in the United States, but not exclusively in the U.S., who are ready to respond more actively to the recent legislation.
If a decision of what to do going forward is made, is there an idea about when it would take place? Would it be 2024? Because we have General Conference every 4 years.
Right.
Is there a time that they're expecting everything to take place, or by this time?
Yeah, nothing officially came out of this meeting in terms of legislation or a specific plan of action. This was more of a conversation and discussion about what do we do now and how can we respond if we believe that the recent vote for the traditional plan does not represent the best of Methodism. So there is a general conference in May of 2020. So I think there would be some legislation that will probably come forward from a whole variety of perspectives, actually, that will be before the General Conference in terms of May 2020. A lot of these changes could require a constitutional amendment if it were changes in structure or that kind of thing. And so that could easily be extended to 2024 or 2028, I think, before they would be resolved. So I think this is a multi-year process that we're still looking at rather than something that will be resolved in the next few months.
So what is the next step in that process?
I think it will be different for different people and different groups of people. I think that we will be seeing a lot more publicity about United Methodist in the United States articulating their problems with the traditional plan and why they think that's contrary to the gospel, contrary to the ministry of Christ, contrary to our own history of how we have dealt with one another and talked about doctrine and theology. But I think it could be everything from, I think we'll see more pastors who are waiting to do same-gender weddings, who are in ministry now with LGBTQ people, but we're hopeful that at 2019 that prohibition would be lifted. So, for example, since it was not lifted, I think we'll see more pastors doing same-gender weddings despite the stricter prohibitions and some automatic kind of mandatory punishments that were included. I think we'll see more Methodist churches supporting LGBTQ organizations, so they might be in their local pride parade, or they might be part of a coalition that's in ministry with LGBTQ youth or that kind of thing. I think we'll see more writing about this issue from Methodist in terms of people articulating why, as a Christian and a United Methodist and somebody in the Wesleyan tradition, has such problems with what was passed. I think there'll be some national kind of things that happen, like days of prayer and calls for Bible study in terms of really understanding what's in Scripture and how we decide if something is culturally specific rather than a general revelation or a universal revelation, but particularly in regard to kind of issues of sexuality. So I think it'll be a pretty wide and broad kind of response in terms of more active resistance to the narrowing of our policies as well as our theology.
What can our listeners do now? Because it's easy to, when you have a big group and we do it as the whole United Methodist Church, but what can our listeners do individually to try to maybe resist or help?
Right. Well, for me as a pastor, I think that's grounded in our own spiritual life. So certainly our own personal faith, our own personal spiritual practices of prayer, worship, Bible study, Christian fellowship, or Christian conferencing. I think that we should stay grounded in all of that. But in terms of individuals, I think they could, have a discussion with their Sunday school class or with their Bible study group. I think they could talk to their pastor to find out where the pastor is on this, and if the pastor's done enough study and reflection on how does this affect Methodism. I think there might be some district gatherings and conference-sized gatherings that people could participate in. Certainly as Methodists, we vote for representation by voting for people to represent us as clergy, and then also to represent us as laity from annual conference to these national and international meetings. So if they're a delegate for their local church, learning about what positions and what perspective different people who have made themselves available for election, that would be important, or maybe more important than ever, to really understand what perspective or approach to faith one of those people running for those representative spots. That's just something we can exercise at all different levels of the church.
I think a lot of folks are weary and disappointed just after this whole process. What thoughts do you have about where we can find hope or encouragement rather than just kind of digging into the disappointment?
Right. I think the hope is found in our faith, that we believe that God has created us and God sees all of us as beloved children. Therefore, we would include everybody in the family of faith, and to begin to think through what does it mean to identify one group of people as incompatible and set aside and set out, so that they have a clear faith grounding. But I think, the energy and the hope comes from talking with other people and organizing together in terms of how we can respond. How can we be more inclusive? How can we be more welcoming? How do we be more caring? As well as, are there things that we can agree on to do together in terms of resistance, so that we kind of keep this issue at the forefront of people's thinking as a relevant issue of faith in this day and time, understanding that harm is being done whenever we are making broad public statements that whole groups of people are incompatible with God or with Christ. Those conversations with others, I think, gives you a sense of energy and hope that you're not alone, that there is hope in this struggle, and there's a great and good possibility for greater inclusion in our lifetimes.
One thing I noticed about after the 2019 General Conference is that people that were silent before and weren't as vocal have stopped being silent, and they realize, this isn't right, we need to do something. I'm going to continue to push hard. And so people that maybe more are in the centrist are going more to the progressive side and saying, no, this is doing harm. We need to work on this and fix it.
Yes, there was a person at the meeting that shared her personal story of at so many different junctures along her faith journey within Methodism, she was excluded or told she wasn't welcome, and yet she's still within the faith family, still working as a faithful Christian, local church leader workshop, assisting other churches, all those kind of things. And so when we hear stories like that of people who have persisted, who've continued to be faithful in their own private life as well as their participation in the church despite being rejected and excluded, I think those also energize and give people hope that there's possibility in the future of better things happening than what we've seen recently.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. Is there anything else you would like to add about the gathering or about your thoughts on it that you have not discussed yet?
I think to understand that there really are people in all quadrants of our nation and across our church that are people of faith, that are leaders in our denomination who are really troubled by that recent vote, remembering that the margin of victory in that vote was just a few votes one way or the other on any number of these issues that were voted upon. That's good to remember. It's not a clear-cut there's a huge majority who's gone one way or another. It's a very divided denomination right now. It appears to me that a majority of United States United Methodist are for full inclusion, but we're dealing with a global context, so there are some realities about that we still need to deal with.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. We're located at 1301 South Boston. Please follow us on either through Facebook or on Instagram or Twitter. Next week, we'll have a very special 3-part series on LGBTQ plus people of faith, getting ready for the Pride Parade. So I hope you're able to listen to that, and we will talk to you later. Thank you.